Welcome to the Global Novel Podcast. I'm your host, Claire Hennessy. Today, we will discuss a seminal figure in world literature, the 19th century French novelist Balzac. Our guests are Dr. Melanie Conroy from the University of Memphis, who also authored literary geographies in Balzac and Proust, and Dr. Julia Titus from Yale University, author of Dostoevsky as a translator of Balzac. Welcome to the show, Melanie and Julia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for inviting us. It's going to be a fascinating conversation.
Right, I believe so. Well, despite being rooted in the 19th century France, Balzac's exploration of universal themes such as love, greed, and ambition makes his work so relevant today, right? So let's begin with your experiences with Balzac. How did you first become interested in reading Balzac? What aspects of his fiction do you find most striking and fascinating?
Well, I grew up in Moscow, and as a little girl, I would visit my grandma, who was an avid reader, and she had a full collection of Balzac works in her armoire. And very often when my parents would linger at dinner, I would go to my grandma's bedroom and I would just read for hours because, those long dinners were very boring for a little girl. And I read at random her books. And interestingly enough, the very first works of Balzac that I read as a teenager were Eugénie Grandet, Père Goriot, and Gobseck, because they were all in the single volume. Then later, I found that very volume because the Soviet Union, I grew up in the Soviet Union, there was avid readers. And so these particular works, Eugénie Grandet and Le Père Goriot, were also part of the series of the school, libraries for high school, because it was expected that all students in high school have some familiarity with foreign literature. So Balzac has always remained one of the central figures in 19th century foreign literature, and like everybody knew of him. And now, just to make us long story short, well, of course, we will talk more about Dostoevsky and Balzac, how Balzac was immensely influenced figure for Dostoevsky, which is my own interest as a Slavist. But I also, on just a personal note, I now own the collected works of my grandma that she gave me as a gift.
I gotta say, that is a very nice inheritance for people like us, isn't it?
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm actually originally from Northern Canada. I also discovered Balzac in the library, but I actually learned about him through Oscar Wilde, who was a great fan of Balzac. And so I was, as a teenager, for some reason, really taken with Oscar Wilde. And so the first Balzac I read was Lost Illusions, because that is one of the key works that Wilde was fascinated with. And so I was really fascinated as a person coming from a small town kind of in the middle of nowhere with this idea of arriving in Paris, a city with all these possibilities that's, that the highs and the lows of life are all possible. And the idea of someone like Lucien arriving and having to make his way in the world, and these kinds of moral choices that a young person would be making, that, you could end up a scholar, a gambler, a lawyer, you could fail as an entrepreneur or as a successful journalist. And so years later, when I went to study and do my master's degree at the University of Paris, I definitely was strongly marked by that early experience with Balzac, and that what I would say is a distinct moral sense of the consequences of your personal choices, right? That you can make these decisions that have so many ramifications for yourself and for society. I think the most striking thing for me now, though, about Balzac is just his enthusiasm for life. We're living in a time when there's this excess of information, excess of possibilities. So many things are open to us, and so many human passions. We can see all the lives that are going on. But I think few writers have captured the excitement of that and the passion of all the human possibilities and all the trajectories that we can follow in life than Balzac.
I agree. Well, for first timers diving into Balzac, what biographical details about his life are considered essential for a deeper understanding of his work?
Well, as Melanie says, what really captures the reader, I think, is his zest for life. And you can see that in his biography, his incessant quest for more and more discovery, because his constant drive on embarking endlessly on new projects, be that the printing presses, or his journey to discover the silver mines in Sicily. All of that is transposed into very memorable characters because, of course, Lucien, that Melanie already mentioned, we have the first part of the Lost Illusions dealing with the printing press and all that mechanics. But Balzac, he journeyed to Russia, for example. Why Dostoevsky thought that Eugenie Grandet would be such an excellent project? Because Balzac just visited the year before, and he was immensely popular in Russia. Also, his way to romanticize daily living, because his also his love affairs, right? His most famous love affair was Evelina Hanska, whom he met by correspondence, essentially, and he corresponded with her by sending the love letters for decades. Essentially, they only met a few times. Then he journeyed to what was then part of the Russian Empire, and he married her there at the end of his life because he died shortly after. So all of that, Balzac's life itself is like a novel. It could be easily part of the human comedy because many episodes of that life can be distilled. His immense, again, breadth of his interests, because he was interested in so many things, in gardening, in, as I said, travels, always intrepid traveler, visited so many places, so many projects, met so many people, was able to connect to people easily, right? Was at ease in very, very various situations in the aristocratic environment, and also had obviously many literary friends and immense zest for life. He was really one of those immensely gifted people, and he wanted to really push himself and to really explore the boundaries of the human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that he was passionate about details and facts. And so, sometimes his works have been criticized as kind of journalistic, that he's got like interest in information or economics or even just prices of things. And so a lot of times teaching Balzac, one of the first things that a modern reader will be struck by is just how long some of the introductions are, descriptions of places, descriptions of people. And I think there's a tendency to see that description as, something that he's sort of required to do in order to, as a part of his like character study. But I really think it's a passion for daily life. And so he's capturing all of these bits of society and bits of things that he's seen, and he's trying to put them together in a kind of systematic way. But it's not, sometimes these things don't really hang together. It's really kind of pure passion that's bringing them together. So, for example, he was absolutely obsessed with the stock market. He was obsessed with the trains and all of these aspects of modern life, that were emerging in Paris. But he actually had relatively little understanding. And so he famously made a bunch of bad bets on publishing and other things because he wanted to put all of his money in one basket, right? Which we as modern readers know that you should try to diversify your assets, right? But he felt that he could pick that one perfect stock and put all of his money on the right number and win. And so I think that duality of deep interest in modern systems, but then also this romantic desire for the right way, for the right path to emerge, is a really important duality that we see both in his life and in his works.
How does Balzac's unique narrative style and storytelling strategies enhance the depth and realism of his characters and settings in the human comedy?
Well, one thing to mention, as Melanie already said, the profusion of detail, but that's because, again, Balzac was first and foremost the realist writer. So he was essentially a flaneur and an observer. And that unites him with Dostoevsky because Dostoevsky famously took a lot of his stories by just reading criminal chronicles of the newspapers in the morning for his morning coffee. He thought, okay, this will be a good whodunit story.
Right.
But that's the Balzac too. The introduction to the human comedy says that he really himself he saw himself as a chronicler, the chronicler of life, that he sees, and that's why he was striving to document it. So for the storytelling style, again, we can just mention his immense powers of observation.
Right.
Because the stories are fused with details, but they're not like catalogs. All these details are meant to tell us something about the narrator. For example, today we will be talking about Eugénie Grandet. And as we all remember, when Charles first appears in the house of Grandet, Eugénie is struck. She looks at him as this celestial being. Why? Because Balzac goes through very long description, what kind of gloves he had, what kind of perfume was on his hair, but all these details are underscoring that immense impression that he makes on Eugénie. It helps the reader to understand why she falls in love with him. Just because all this, his accoutrement, all that stuff that he brings with him are so out of her ordinary life. He's like a dream, like a vision. And similarly, from the perception of Charles, the narrative strategist, when Charles looks at Le Cruchot, he sees that the white colors of their shirts are now yellowed because they've been only washed twice a year. And so that all tells us, that little detail tells us immense information about how different these two worlds are. His fancy Parisian world, where he brings the latest fashion, and the world of provincial life, where Eugénie is. And he doesn't say, Balzac doesn't need to tell us, these Cruchot are so boring and they are so unhygienic and, they never left the little town, but he just tells it all because look at the yellow linens, they were as wrinkled as their faces. And that's all he says.
Yeah, another aspect of Balzac is that he's obsessed with wins and losses, and especially really big wins and really big losses. So he's always looking at, people who've gone into immense political power or been genuinely great writers versus the people who are not successful and honestly maybe commit suicide in these sort of very drastic outcomes. And so he works very hard within his character system to pair people. He has multiple young law students. Many of the young women are strivers who are trying to marry up. And so by looking at this whole character system through the various tales that he tells and his obsession with plot, you can kind of compare the outcome of a particular character with another character where they, started in the same place, but ended up with very different consequences. So I think that taste for, really final judgments, dramatic falls, triumphant successes, shows how much he's interested in this kind of moral system of finally judgment, judging the characters and deciding who deserved to do well and who actually did.
Well, Melanie, your book explores how spaces interact in fictional worlds and the imaginary of physical space as seen through the lenses of characters' perceptions in Balzac and Proust. Could you provide a kind of glimpse into this concept of a literary geography, what it is and how it can be used to interpret fiction, right? And what valuable insights does this tool or approach often reveal?
Well, literary geography, I would say, and this is Barbara Piatti's observation, is more of a topic, really. And so there's so many different ways that you can approach space in fiction, but specifically literary mapping. So if we're looking at taking place references in fictional texts and making those correspond to the globe, then in that case, really, Balzac is an excellent example because he did actually do such a close study of Paris, of various provincial towns, and then he's also got this kind of vast set of place references to every continent actually except Antarctica. And so through his repeating characters, he's able to have characters experience places really all around the world. And then people within those networks, whether they're family networks or trading networks, often come together in France or more specifically in Paris. And so he's got this kind of hub structure where many of the characters are meeting in Paris, but they're characters who have experienced the Napoleonic Wars, or they're characters who have been trading in the Indies. And so his version of literary geography as sort of the father of realism is one of the most vast, and it's also one that really represents the globe kind of as it was understood, I think, in his time period. The 18th century and the 19th century in France are obsessed with mapping. And so this is a lot of the first statistical and geographical studies of Paris, of France, of Europe by French cartographers. And that work extends around the world. And so Balzac is obsessed with maps and mapping. And then in the Avant-Propos, he says that his society in the human comedy has its own geography as well as its own families and genealogy. So he draws attention to the ways that he's using geography.
Right.
But it's especially in this repeating characters where he can have characters who are in the Americas or characters who are in the Indies. And they can encounter other characters maybe in a different time frame, or it can be the daughter, or it can be the grandfather of a certain character, and really bring them into relationship with each other in a way that is very hard to do in the space of a shorter text or a shorter novel.
Fascinating. Well, what is your major discovery and argument from using this approach in your book?
So one of the arguments I put forward, and it's sort of a brave one, is that it's the first truly global series of novels, because Balzac can use these repeating characters and have someone experience places. So somebody goes to Saint-Domingue, somebody goes to North America, somebody goes to South America, and so by having these repeating characters, especially through a lot of the military figures, through a lot of trader merchants or characters like Gobseck, who have a lot of investments in far off places, they're able to put the families into relation with each other through things like marriages or through capitalism, which of course is one of the forces which is pushing towards globalization during Balzac's own lifetime.
Well, can you give an example from the human comedy where geographical references in the text relate to voice, narration, and characters?
So I think there's a real nostalgia in Balzac for the old regime and the Restoration, which isn't exactly political. It's not really exactly a desire to bring back the old regime. But at the same time, he does have this very anti-capitalist tendency where he feels that, modern life has been degraded by all these kinds of forms of mediation like money and journalism and bureaucracy, where we're always communicating through the written word instead of face-to-face communication. And so he has a real nostalgia for Italy or Spain or the Orient, or places that he can imagine are not as complicated as Paris. And so people can live in these smaller social structures and they can interact face to face. And so I think that really has a geographical element where he feels that, that kind of authentic life really isn't possible in Paris. And so he's kind of searching the globe for places where he could have that more authentic life. But, it's something that's fleeting. Paris is the main, focus of many of the novels, and many of his characters are sort of young, journalists and people, who go to law school in the same milieus as he is. And so this kind of romantic other world, it's not like in Baudelaire or something where that's most of what we're getting. It's kind of something that we see flashes of in these, especially backstories.
Well, Julia, Balzac's first novel, Eugénie Grandet, is worth mentioning here because of so many fascinating aspects that it has. We know when Balzac was completing it, he conceived the human comedy. Also, the famous Russian novelist Dostoevsky translated it, as you mentioned, and this is precisely what your recent monograph is about. It is such an interesting comparative reading of his Russian translation against Balzac's original, right? Let's start with the characterization of Eugénie Grandet. Could you talk about the significance of Félix Grandet's character in Balzac's novel? How Does his portrayal as a multifaceted miser and a shrewd businessman contribute to the novel's exploration of greed and moral corruption?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Eugenie Grandet is the first novel that again opens the cycle of human comedy.
If you have enjoyed this episode so far and desire to continue the rest of the episode, where our guests talk about Eugenie Grandet as the precursor of the human comedy, as well as Balzac's influence on Proust and Dostoevsky, we encourage you to subscribe at theglobalnovel.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.